There's something in the woods. Before I leave, I think I want to make a written account here. That way, if someone comes looking for me, they might understand what happened and where I went. Whether or not they will believe me is another story entirely. I don't intend to tell anyone I am leaving, but I would feel guilty if I just left without a trace. My name is Jane Goodwill. I moved to the small town of Leonardsville after living in the big city for the last 4 years. While I enjoyed city life, it honestly had started to become a bit suffocating. Having to deal with the constant traffic, avoiding certain areas due to crime rates, and the usual issues with the city. The pay was good, but that was nearly pointless when you realized just how much rent and insurance were. To add to that, I hadn't made too many friends, and those that I had mostly just talked over the internet anyways. Not that I was much better at getting out, in their defense. Really though, I could have dealt with all of that, up until I had the wonderful privilege of acquiring a stalker, Henry. I had met him through work, and we went on a couple of dates, but I didn't really feel any spark, so I turned down the 3rd date. I wasn't one to lead someone on after all. Unfortunately, I still worked with the guy, and he seemed to not understand that I wasn't interested. He continued to ask me out on dates, get a bit too close for comfort at work, and occasionally even refer to me as his girlfriend in front of our coworkers. I went to management, and that eventually put an end to the harassment at work, but it escalated things outside of work. I had caught him multiple times attempting to follow me home, and though I didn't have any proof, I swear he was outside my apartment at night too. While dealing with all of this, my mother was doing her best to help. She knew I didn't really enjoy the city too much, and suggested that maybe a change of scenery would work. Leonardsville was far, far away from the city that I was currently staying in, which meant I wouldn't have to deal with Henry anymore. Plus, it was a small town too. That meant rent would be cheap, and I could enjoy a bit more peace and quiet in my life. When she also added that my auntie Margaret ran a bookshop and could give me some work, I finally caved in and took her up on her offer. I turned in my resignation notice covertly to my boss and started packing. Within the next week, I was on my way. Turns out Margaret also had a few rental properties around town, and before I could even ask, she set me up in a cottage on the edge of the nearby forest. I wasn't expecting much when she told me about the place, but when I pulled into the gravel driveway midday, it was of course a cottage, so nothing massive, but that kind of made the place more welcoming. The front of the home had a pair of windows that faced out towards the faraway neighbors in town. The cottage was small, so its lone red door led straight into the living room/kitchen. The place looked to have been renovated recently too, noting the fresh coats of paint as I hauled my things in. After making a mountain of boxes in the living room, I started to put away the few food items that I had brought with me into the pantry. Just above the kitchen sink was another window that faced the forest. Evergreens swaying gently with the summer breeze. I loved nature and had almost forgotten what it was like to just sit back and enjoy a view like that. All those years being cooped up in the concrete jungle just melting away as I leaned against the counter and enjoyed that view just a bit longer. I could get used to this. My first night in the cottage was spectacular as well. I couldn't remember the last time I had slept so deeply, and when I woke up, I actually felt well rested for once. Something else I could vividly remember was the dream that I had had last night. I was somewhere in the woods, the sun coming through the trees in golden rays. Off in the distance, in between the trees, I could see the shape of someone, but just couldn't quite make them out clearly. I didn't feel scared though. Far from it. If anything, I felt an overwhelming sense of calm from the figure. The dream was still fresh in my mind as I got ready and started my first day of work, alert and awake. The irony. It only took a few hours at the shop to realize how lax it was. My last job had been an assistant manager at a retail store, which meant if I wasn't busy doing one thing, I was off doing another almost always. Here, however, was another story. It was so dead. I asked Margaret if this was normal, and she said it varied on the day, but it definitely happened frequently. I almost felt bad, even though I was being paid so little. I tried to keep myself busy, but eventually I ran out of things to do. Margaret suggested that while I waited for customers, I could always read from the selection we had. There wasn't any radio set up here, so that was the next best thing to entertainment in a way, and I hadn't really sat down to read in quite some time. Browsing through the store's collection, I was surprised at just how varied it all was. A lot of stuff I had never heard of before, most of which were things like holistic medicine, astrology, and a lot of other folklore-type books. After a bit of skimming, I settled on a book that would be a good page-turner. I can't quite remember the title, but it was all about witchcraft and apparently misconceptions about it. I had read a few pages when Margaret walked out of the back. Spotting me nestled in my chair by the front door, she seemed to take quick notice of just what book I was reading and quirked an eyebrow at me. It wasn't judgment that she was showing, though, as she asked if I had any kind of serious interest in that stuff. I told her that while I found the subject fascinating, I wasn't exactly planning on learning to fly a broom anytime soon. That got a laugh out of her, and she let me be. On my first weekend off, I spent some time in my backyard tending to what was supposed to be a vegetable garden. It had been overrun by weeds and other bits of scrap, but I knew once all that was cleared away, it would be perfect to start growing again. With a pair of old gardening gloves, I began pulling out the weeds, the sun high in the sky warming my skin as I worked. After a couple of hours, I started to get a strange feeling. It was hard to place at first, but either I had convinced myself of it, or my sixth sense was working well, because I had that overwhelming feeling that I was being watched from somewhere. My eyes scanned around the backyard and eventually across the forest tree line. The sun ensured that the forest was covered in shadows caused by the evergreen branches, so it took some time before I could really see in between the trees. Just as my eyes had started to adjust, I actually spotted movement, a dark figure that had been just standing beside a tree. It didn't look like any kind of animal I knew. It was far too tall for that, and I could swear it had almost looked like some kind of person. Being braver than I was smart, I grabbed my shovel and started over in the direction that I had seen the figure, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone there? Are you lost or something?" I tried my best to keep my tone friendly, but really I was pretty annoyed. I had already dealt with one stalker in my life, and the thought of someone staring at me again wasn't one I was about to just let by. When I got over to the edge of the forest, I hesitated for just a moment, not having passed this threshold before. I took in a deep breath before checking behind the trees that I had seen that shape. There was no signs of disturbance on the forest floor, at least not anything I could spot. After a bit of searching, the only thing I found was a small kind of doll. It was made with rough cloth and stuffed with pine needles, head, arms, and legs all tied off in coarse rope as well. Stone buttons made the eyes, and it had a neatly sewn-on mouth too, in a strange kind of orange thread. I really couldn't say whether I was freaked out at the time or impressed by the work. It was very well made considering the components. With the doll in hand, I made my way back to my garden, figuring it must have just been my imagination. Or I had actually seen a child that ran off because they thought they were in trouble. I ended up keeping the doll on my shelf inside. I don't know why. I really should have felt creeped out by the thing, but it had the opposite effect. There was this sense of safety that the doll brought with it whenever I looked at it or touched it. That night was a bit tougher for my sleep. I had awful nightmares that left me tossing and turning all night, dreaming of figures that were trying to break into the cottage, images of hands clawing on my bedroom door, eyes staring in from the windows, and whispers that seeped into my subconscious. When it was finally morning, I got out of bed exhausted, but at the very least, the nightmares didn't stay in my memory. Going out to the living room, I noticed a couple of strange things. For one, the doll had fallen over, and now lay face down on the floor. It had somehow managed to get all the way to the kitchen, directly below the window. That window was the second strange thing. It was slightly ajar, just a few inches, but when I went over to inspect it, I noticed that the lock had been busted off. This got me checking all the locks in the house. The back door's handle was loose now, and there were light scratches all around the outside of it too, that I didn't remember being there before. At this point, I really hoped that I was just being paranoid, but I still called Margaret and let her know about the damages just in case. She told me she'd get some replacement locks for them, and she'd install them after the shop was closed. She also tried to comfort me in saying that the place was pretty old, so things did occasionally fall apart like that, unfortunately. When I arrived at work, I was greeted with a platter of baked goodies and some fresh coffee, quickly forgetting the strangeness of the cottage by bribery alone. I spent most of the day talking with Margaret, which eventually led back to the book I was reading. She told me that this area had a long history of witchcraft, some of which was in part to the witch trials of old falsely prosecuted women being killed or beaten. That actually led to many of the women of the area eventually practicing Wicca or witchcraft in more modern times. There seemed to be something more that Margaret wanted to say, but didn't, as a couple of times she almost went into the topic of the forest, but strayed away. Especially when I mentioned the doll I had found, she seemed to try her best to go along with my kid's story, but didn't do a very convincing job at it. Maybe she was just trying to keep my mind off it, honestly. A week passed without any more incidents. I caught up on the sleep I had missed the day after, and the only thing to put a damper on my mood was the weather. It had been getting progressively worse, starting out with cloudy days that led to rain. I wanted to work on my garden, but it seemed like I was destined to sit on the couch instead. At least the ambience was nice. I did have a couple more nightmares, but nothing as bad as the first one, up until the first storm. Again, I tossed and turned all night, through them all, but didn't retain what they were. Unlike the last time, however, when I woke up, I didn't find anything inside the house different or any doors ajar. That was until I stepped outside of the house to leave for work. The rain had turned most of the ground around the cottage to mud where there wasn't grass, and it was evident almost immediately that there were footprints all around the cottage. It looked like someone had been pacing there all night. When I told Margaret this at the shop, she said she'd get in contact with someone she knew at the police station just in case. They wouldn't be able to find the footprints, the rain hadn't let up since, but the least they could do is send a couple of patrol cars during the next few nights. Finally, the rain turned to thunder and lightning a few days later. I was home, and luckily the power was holding up, but the tin roof of the cottage made all the noise from the storm much louder than usual, which made it hard to focus on anything. Instead, I lay in bed resting my eyes, eventually letting the sound of rain scattering across the roof take me off to sleep. I was having another nightmare again, and this one was the worst one yet. There was this overwhelming sense of danger that filled the foggy scene in the forest, a scene that was shattered by the sound of broken glass that brought me awake instantly. The storm still raged outside, but now I could hear that the rain was inside too. At first I thought it had just been the storm that had broken the window. However, I left my bedroom and flicked on the light switch to inspect the damage. I stifled a scream as a bloodied arm reached through the window to try and grab at the lock to the back door, a part of my mind helpfully informing me that it wasn't the storm that had caused this. I grabbed one of my potted plants that was sitting nearby and hurled it at the hand to try to get it away from the lock, the pot shattering just next to it. Despite this, the one outside was not deterred by this, and all I could do was run towards the door to try and stop them as it finally clicked the lock open. The lightning flashed outside and illuminated the would-be intruder, and I recognized that crazed face immediately. It was Henry. What I also managed to see was in his other hand was a rather large knife that was slick with rain. I threw my entire body against the door as it started to open, getting it to shut but unable to reach the lock from my position. I heard him swear, but he soon began ramming his shoulder against the door, getting it open for a few moments each time before I gathered the strength again to put it shut. He roared to be let in, as my mind ran in a panic for what to do. Then I heard something else. In another crack of thunder and lightning, there was a horrible tearing noise that came out from the forest, one that was followed by an agonizing scream from Henry. It sounded like his scream had been pulled out of him as his voice pulled away into the darkness of the forest. I locked the door again and hauled myself up to my feet, ignoring the bits of glass that had bitten into the soles of them as I looked out the window to try and see what had happened. The forest was dark for some time before another flash of lightning illuminated the area. As it did, it seemed to freeze, like the night sky stayed lit up for a few more seconds than it should have. There, in between the trees, I saw Henry, or rather, what was left. His body was impaled from all sides by long, winding branches that had hauled him up into the air, the wood looking more like serpents as it had coiled through and around his body, dragging him deeper into the woods. And there below him, I finally saw her, an old woman, lines etched with age, and shockingly white hair that extended below her waist. She was dressed in a mixture of cloth and leaves. This woman stared at me before extending out a gnarled hand, a beckoning finger, being sent my way before I watched her disappear into the woods once more. I sat in my kitchen until morning came, just trying to process everything I had seen. I think I'm going to take her up on her offer, if that's even what it was. After all, I owe her my life now.